Well, first of all, thank you very much to you all for coming and listening to us. And secondly, thank you particularly to United Nations Watch and NGO Monitor Hillel and Gerald for organising this event and for organising so smoothly the various other events that have taken place to try and get as far as we possibly can the truth out into the UN Human Rights Commission. So I really commend both of you for your efforts. It's a real honour to speak here today on the same panel as General Jones and Colonel Corn, both very, very distinguished military men. Of course, Britain and America very strong allies. And I've met Colonel Corn before. We had the pleasure of speaking together. Well, I had the pleasure. I didn't say it's a pleasure for him. We had the pleasure of speaking together on a conference in Jerusalem. But having heard both him and General Jones speaking today, I'm just so pleased that there are two voices of sanity out there who are prepared to stand up and speak objectively about this situation, because there's so few people who are prepared to do so. So it's an honour to be sitting here. There's been a little bit of a build-up recently, which probably has been met by dismay in some quarters, of people who are prepared, experts who are prepared, it seems, to stand up and tell the truth about what's been happening in Israel and Gaza. And I've already mentioned, and you've heard the readout from General Jones and Colonel Corn's group, obviously a very important group, visited Israel, came up with the opposite findings pretty much of the United Nations Human Rights Council. There were two US lawyers, and I'm afraid I've forgotten their names now, but two US lawyers recently, I think about a month ago, published a very compelling report about the Israeli legal system, how the Israelis apply the laws of armed conflict, the laws of war, and how they investigate allegations of either breaches of the law of war or other forms of misbehaviour by Israeli soldiers. It's a very powerful, strong report. And indeed, we heard in November last year, we heard General Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most powerful military man in the world, saying that Israel had taken extraordinary steps to save the lives of innocent civilians during the Gaza conflict, having himself sent out a delegation, a fact-finding delegation from the Pentagon. And finally, we have a group which we call the High-Level International Military Group, which I was a part of. I was the lowest level of the high-level group, but it was made up mainly of former chiefs of staff of a number of national armed forces, generals, a former ambassador responsible for investigation of war crimes for the United States, and a former national security advisor. We had 11 members of that group, representing 7 different countries: United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, Holland, Spain, Italy, Australia and Colombia. There are other members of the group as well who weren't able to come with us on that visit that we made to Israel in May. We were led in that mission by General Klaus Naumann, who is the former Chief of Staff of the Bundeswehr and former Chairman of the NATO Military Committee, which is the most senior military officer in NATO. And we also had with us Giulio Terzi, the former Foreign Minister of Italy. So it was a powerful group. They were completely independent. No one told them what to say. Contrary, no doubt, to various accusations and speculations, they were not in the pay of the international Zionist conspiracy. Unfortunately, it'd be nice to. They were essentially, like General Jones' group, they were a group of highly experienced professional military officers going, applying their own knowledge, experience and insight to what has happened in Israel. They had unique access to the Prime Minister right the way down to military commanders fighting who fought the war in Gaza during that conflict. I'm just going to briefly, I'm not going to go through this in detail because actually it won't surprise anyone probably to know that the major findings of that group were very similar to the findings of General Jones's group, because of course these were people, well, there was one American general among them from the US Air Force, but they weren't all Americans, but they were all pretty much all NATO allies, and therefore operate, and we used to operate into similar doctrines and had similar experiences of military operations. So it's hardly surprising that they essentially came to very similar conclusions. After the report they will produce, they've only produced an interim report so far, they will produce a more detailed report in the autumn. But I'm not going to therefore go through all of those findings again, because we've heard pretty much all of the things they come up with. But I just want to mention a couple of key ones. And one thing that sort of struck me really from their interim report was the comment made, and this is, as I say, from senior officers representing 7 different national militaries. And they said, the Israel Defence Force employed a series of precautionary measures to reduce civilian casualties. Each of our own armies is, of course, committed to protecting civilian life during combat, but none of us is aware of any army that takes such extensive measures as did the IDF last summer to protect the lives of the civilian population in such circumstances. Now, I agree with that comment as well. And I think partly it's not really, I don't think, just because anyone's suggesting that the IDF is better than any other army. I don't think anyone would suggest, anyone of us would suggest that. What I think the point is that in relation to the Gaza conflict, tragically, the IDF have had immense practice at fighting this kind of conflict in this exact area, too much. And not only that, but they also, whereas the British and American forces will fight in huge areas of Afghanistan, vast areas of Iraq, places like Libya, in the case of the Americans now even Syria, and other countries around the world. So we don't quite have the focus on a single small area that the IDF managed to have on the Gaza Strip. The intelligence they were able to collect on it, the expertise they had on it, the long knowledge, lengthy knowledge they had, enabled them, I think, to take their moral standards, their laws, and bring the two things together and come up with a series of very detailed measures that few other people would be able to accomplish. I mean, if you're fighting, let's say, the Battle of Fallujah, is it likely to be reasonable you'll know the phone numbers of all the houses there and be able to ring them up or send text messages to people or contact, make contacts to trusted intermediaries? No, it's not likely, but it was possible and it did happen in Gaza. So I think that's part of the reason why that was the case. But whatever the reason is, that was the case, and I think quite a striking finding from that group. Another thing that struck us all was the extent to which the IDF went in restraining themselves from carrying out attacks against confirmed Hamas targets when they knew that civilians were present there and would result in disproportionate death. Even to the extent, and I'm not going to repeat the cases now because I was told some of this stuff in confidence, but even to the extent that Israeli Defence Force restraint on attacking targets resulted in the deaths of Israeli citizens during that conflict because the targets weren't struck. I'm not saying again that's unique, that is not unique either. In British and American forces there are a number of occasions when we have restrained ourselves or taken, in some cases, deliberate action where our soldiers have died to save the lives of civilians. So it's not necessarily unique, but it is something worth bearing in mind. It's something worth keeping in one's mind. And the second kind of striking point, I think, was the immense effort that the IDF went to, which I don't think, as far as I know, is mentioned in that report, and I have read it, but I don't remember seeing it. The immense effort the IDF went to deliver humanitarian aid to the citizens of Gaza. They enabled the passage of vast quantities of humanitarian aid into Gaza. They maintained electricity supply, they maintained water supply. And it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that. That act has two major disadvantages. One of them is that very few armies in the world, when it's carrying out active, lethal military operations against an enemy that's trying to kill you, very few armies in the world will then resupply that area, knowing that much of that resupply will get to your enemy. And knowing also, when you carry out humanitarian ceasefires for the purpose of resupplying the civilian population, that it gives the enemy an opportunity to regroup, to reposition themselves, to lick their wounds, and to get ready for the next round. That is something that few commanders would actually consider doing, I think, in most circumstances. The second aspect of that, which again few people know and is not well publicised, is that the crossing point that was used, the main crossing point was used into Gaza, came under repeated attack from Hamas while the IDF was bringing humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip for Hamas's own civilians. Attack after attack after attack. Threatening Israeli soldiers, of course, and the Israeli civilians who were involved in manning the crossings. So, again, you know, and they carried on, they still did it. So is this the apartheid state? Is this the state that's responsible for war crimes we've heard about repeatedly in the UN Human Rights Council this morning? In fact, I would say that the thing that struck most of us in our group in Israel last month was that what we saw, and many of the officers that were there, probably I would say most, if not all of the officers that were there, I was probably an exception in having significant experience of observing, seeing and working alongside the IDF in the past. Very few of them had done that. And they were quite surprised, I think, by the extent of the measures that the IDF took. And we all found that it wasn't just the general view that you see expressed in the media or in the United Nations is a bit offline. We found it was the diametric opposite of what the reality is. That not only was the IDF not deliberately, as a matter of policy, trying to kill innocent civilians, but going further than most people, most armies in this world will contemplate going to save the lives of civilians. That's all I want to say about the report. I just want to mention a couple of other observations about the high-level international military group report. I want to mention another couple of points quickly. The first one, in fact, what I want to do now is I want to read to you the testimony that I gave to the UN Human Rights Council this morning. Don't worry, it only takes 2 minutes. In fact, it took 2 minutes and 10 seconds and I was cut off before I finished in my prime. But I want to read it because I think most of you probably weren't there, which I think you're probably quite pleased about. What I said was this: Mr. Vice President, I fought in combat zones around the world during 30 years service in the British Army. I was present as an observer throughout the conflict in Gaza. During the entire 2014 Gaza conflict, Hamas, to its eternal shame, did more to deliberately and systematically inflict death, suffering and destruction on its own civilian population, including its children, than any other terrorist group in history. Hamas deliberately positioned its fighters and weapons in civilian areas, knowing that Israel would have no choice but to attack these targets, which were a clear and present threat to the lives of Israel's own civilian population. While the IDF made efforts unprecedented in any other army and exceeding the requirements of the laws of war to save Palestinian civilian lives, including warning them to leave target zones, Hamas forced them to remain in those areas. Unable to defeat Israel by military means, Hamas sought to cause large numbers of casualties among their own people in order to bring international condemnation against Israel, especially from the United Nations. This was the cornerstone of Hamas's strategy. It was Hamas's strategy, not illegal Israeli action, as this report shamefully alleges, without a shred of evidence, that was the reason why over 1,000 civilians died in Gaza. And by denying this truth and by refusing to admit the manifest reality that the conflict in Gaza was caused by Hamas's war of aggression against Israel, this report faithfully reiterates Hamas's own false narrative. The Council has for too long allowed itself to become a tool of Hamas's murderous strategy. By unjustly condemning Israel, by refusing to condemn Hamas's repeated and unprovoked aggression, this Council has consistently validated and encouraged Hamas's tactics. I urge all the delegates to this Council to reject this report. Failure to do so amounts to support of Hamas terrorism and will result in further rounds of violence in Gaza and Israel. The price for that will be paid in the blood of the people of Gaza and Israel. That was the main emphasis that I wanted to make. Obviously, I had about 4 hours worth of points I wanted to make to the UN Human Rights Council, but Hillel wouldn't allow me to. But I just wanted to briefly, I'm conscious of time, I just want to touch on a couple of miscellaneous additional points. The first one that I found quite shocking about this report is the way in which this report treats the Israel Defense Force and Hamas as equivalent. Moral equivalence. It is morally bankrupt to do that. There is no comparison between the two. The Israel Defense Force is the legitimate army of a democratic government in a Western liberal democracy fighting to defend its people. Hamas, on the other hand, is a ruthless terrorist organisation, prescribed as a terrorist organisation around the world, intent on subjugating and suppressing, brutally suppressing and repressing the people in Gaza, and also intent on the destruction, by its charter, intent on the destruction of a member state of the United Nations, in other words, Israel. So what is the comparison? It's like comparing the United States Army and the Islamic State. Of course there's no comparison. How can a United Nations body that we pay our taxes to keep in business, how can it draw that moral equivalence between the Hamas and the Israel Defense Force? The IDF is not perfect, and the General, I think, Colonel Corn mentioned it just now, but the IDF isn't perfect. They make mistakes, like our army, like the British Army makes mistakes. There are errors of judgment made by commanders in the heat of battle, or because they've got too little sleep, or whatever it might be, but there are errors of judgment made. Mistakes happen as a result. There's a very big difference, again, between somebody who's sitting in a command centre in Tel Aviv directing air operations and somebody who's actually pinned down in the alleyways of Shajaria in Gaza with shell fire around them, with people sniping at them, with machine guns, with the possible of a suicide attack, with maybe casualties being taken, with the fog of war and everything that you know about and associate with war. There's a big difference between the kind of judgment you can make in those circumstances. Equipment goes wrong. You know how often does your computer freeze? How often does some microwave in your house not work properly? Do you have microwaves in Switzerland? I don't know. But this stuff all goes wrong. And of course it goes wrong 10 times as often in the heat of battle. Missiles that cost thousands of pounds that are supposed to hit a target will go over there. Radios break down at the critical moment. Command and control systems fail. Intelligence fails. Intelligence, I spent a lot of my time working in intelligence, and I can tell you intelligence is an art, not a science. And more often than not, actually, it's wrong. That may be a slight exaggeration, but I think the reality is that even the most sophisticated terrorist organisations, intelligence organisations, often fail to produce an accurate result. So, and also every army has bad soldiers. I'm sure the US Army doesn't have any bad soldiers, but the British Army certainly has its share of bad soldiers, and the IDF, I'm sure, does as well. And they make mistakes because they're not very good at their job, or because maybe they're malicious. You handed me something, tell me to shut up. Okay, I've got to shut up now. I'm going to finish off very briefly. I will shut up. I'll just say finally. I mean, I think the UN attitude towards Israel, so much of the media attitude towards Israel, the intention of the BDS movement to try and use things like the Gaza conflict to delegitimize Israel, to force Israel into the International Criminal Court, to ruin Israel internationally. It reminds me of a situation maybe back in the 30s where Western nations were appeasing the Nazis. This is like that, except it's like what's happening with this lawfare campaign is like the Western nations appeasing the Nazis and at the same time trying to prosecute the Poles who are trying to fight the Nazis off. That's the way I see it. Anyway, I apologise for going over time, and I'm now finally going to shut up.